Hello friends, I welcome you all to another edition of Daily News Analysis. So in this particular edition, we are going to discuss some very important articles. Particularly the first important article that we are going to discuss is about the recent monsoon session and particularly its productivity. Some important bills being passed, but again the monsoon session stalled. So over the period of time, what is the situation when it comes to the productivity of Indian Parliament? Important debate from the perspective of again prelims as well as mains. Another important article that we are going to discuss is about NTCA limiting tiger corridors to minimum requirement, multiple projects to benefit due to this particular NTCA limit on tiger corridors. Again important from the perspective of GS3 environment, prelims as well as mains. Another important article that we are going to discuss is about RBI's recent paper on monetary policy. So what are some of the important suggestions in that particular policy when it comes to inflation control in India, important again from the perspective of GS3 economy, prelims as well as mains. Another important article that we are going to discuss and very interesting and considering the recent boom in cosmetology clinics, important article named India's Unregulated Cosmetology Clinics. So essentially, what are the issues when it comes to the recent boom in the cosmetology, particularly the clinics which are mushrooming nowadays? So, what sort of regulations the government can come up with? Important analysis again from the perspective of mainly mains, but from the perspective of prelims, you must know some of the names of the chemicals which are essentially important from the perspective of particularly cosmetology. In the decoded section, we are going to take a look at important explain page article in the Indian Express named Why Environmentalists Have Criticized Haryana Government's New Definition of Forest. Important analysis again from the perspective of GS3 environment. So stay tuned for that particular analysis as well. So the first important article that we are going to discuss is about the recent monsoon session and its productivity. So essentially the monsoon session has ended now with 12 bills being passed, but no SIR discussion with low productivity. So what has happened over the period of time is most of the time the monsoon session or whether it is monsoon session or whether it is budget session, the limited amount of discussion on some of the important topics and the bills being passed with less discussion in the parliament is an issue which is actually hampering the overall productivity as well as democratic governance in India. The recently concluded monsoon session of the 18th Lok Sabha was marked by turbulence and low productivity, as I earlier discussed. While Parliament introduced 14 bills and passed 12, the session witnessed continuous disruptions, protests over special intensive revisions in Bihar and limited full-fledged discussions. So there are very few limited full-fledged discussions. Only the discussion about Operation Sindoor was more fruitful, I will say. The other bills that are being passed, most of the time due to the disruptions, the provisions in the bills were not sufficiently discussed in the parliaments, and most of the time this particular angle has been criticized by Supreme Court in its own judgments as well. Most of the time the less scrutiny of bills will lead to more sort of issues for the implementation of that particular bill when it becomes an act in the future. Both houses now function far below their planned working hours, with meaningful debates largely restricted to the discussion on Operation Sindoor, as I said, reflecting a session dominated by sloganeering, procedural deadlocks, and rather than a legislative deliberation. So 3 Ds are often the casualties. What are the 3 Ds? Debate, deliberation and discussion. That is the primary goal of the parliament, but the disruption most of the time actually do away with these 3 Ds. So let's talk about the productivity of the current monsoon session which was ended in recent times. What about the functioning time? Lok Sabha functioned for just 29% of its allotted time, that is for around 37 hours. Baki ka time almost is washed up due to the disruptions. Rajya Sabha on the other hand worked for 34% of the allotted time, 41.15 hours of the total discussion hours for the Rajya Sabha, again very low for the body like all India level body like the Indian Parliament. Question hour on the other hand, is at 23% in Lok Sabha, and in Rajya Sabha it is around 6%. So, you can see the less number of question hour discussions being done in this particular monsoon session as well. 537 matters raised under Rule 377, matters of urgent public importance. 61 notices received for discourse on matters of public interest, but none of them admitted. Parliamentary oversight remained active. Panels represented a total of 124 reports. So, that is the bright spot in this monsoon session, that parliamentary oversight remained active through its parliamentary panel reports. In question hour, in 419 starred question were admitted, but only 55 were answered. So, essentially you can see the less utilization of question hour in this particular monsoon session. Questions taken up, Lok Sabha took up 55 questions, starred questions out of 419, while Rajya Sabha only 14 out of 285 total. So, you can see the overall productivity of the monsoon session, which is essentially very low. So, but you can observe over the period of time since the independence, in 1950s, the Indian Parliament's productivity or number of sessions, number of days the Parliament worked in sessions was around 120, 130 days at that point of time in 1950s, 1960s. But over the period of decades, you can see the decline in the number of days that Parliament has functioned. So, in recent decades, we have seen as low as 60, 70 days of functioning days for the Parliament. So, we can clearly see the reduced productivity over the period of time for the Indian Parliament. Let's look at some of the basics of the Parliament now, which you can get the question on in prelims. Sessions of Parliament are periods when both houses meet to conduct legislative and other parliamentary business. There is a constitutional mandate behind this. There is a constitutional provision in Article 85, which empowers the President to summon each house at intervals not exceeding 66 months. Remember this particular provision here. So, there is no sort of provision which says that there will be 3 sessions in 1 year. It is just the convention. But what is the constitutional provisions when it comes to parliamentary sessions? It is Article 85, which empowers the President to summon each house at the intervals not exceeding 6 months. So, by convention we have 3 sessions each year. There is a budget session which is generally from February to March. Longest session begins with President's address and Union budget presentation, focuses on discussion, amendment and approval of the budget along with other legislative business. Then after that we have monsoon session, which for this particular year conducted recently or concluded recently rather, which is generally from July to August, primarily for enacting legislations, debating bills and discussing important national issues. After that we have winter session, which will generally be from November to December. Reviews government policies, initiatives, discussions, pending legislation, examines performance through questions, motions and debates. So, general parliamentary work. So, these are the 3 sessions in each year, which is by convention. There is Article 85, which says President should summon each house at intervals not exceeding 6 months. So, that is the primary provision when it comes to conducting the sessions. Remember that. Governing rules. Sessions are governed by the Indian Constitution and the rules of procedure and conduct of business in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. So, what is the purpose of having these particular sessions? Is to facilitate lawmaking, discussions on important public issues and oversight of the executive. So, let us look at some of the key terms when it comes to the parliamentary session. So, there is first and foremost adjournment. So, what is an adjournment? Adjournment is a temporary suspension of sitting for hours, days or weeks pending business resumes on reconvening. So, essentially adjournment is done by the parliamentary authorities like, and in the case of Rajya Sabha, it is obviously done by Rajya Sabha chairman. Remember that. What is the meaning of adjournment? Sine die, ends a sitting indefinitely without fixed reassembly date. the presiding officer can reconvene the house any time. So, adjournment sine die is also done by the presiding officers of Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha. On the other hand, there is a prorogation which formally ends the session, which is done by the president, follows adjournment sine die, session resumes with a new sitting. Remember, there is a recess as well, interval between the prorogation of one session and the start of the next is called a recess, which cannot exceed 6 months according to the constitutional provision that we just saw. Then there is a dissolution as well, complete termination of the Lok Sabha, triggering new elections occur automatically after 5 years or by presidential decree. Unlike prorogation, it is a final. So, these are some of the important terms here. See, remember the difference between adjournment, sine die and prorogation, and which is the authority which is authorized to actually trigger these particular motions or sort of debates. So, remember that. So, this is important practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. This particularly is the PYQ which you will be able to answer effectively if you have paid attention to this particular article. So, another important article that we are going to discuss is about tiger corridors. So, NTCA now has limited tiger corridors to minimal requirement, multiple projects to benefit due to this. So, what has happened now is the NTCA, that is National Tiger Conservation Authority, has issued a clarification limiting the number of tiger corridors primarily to only 32 least cost pathways identified in 2014. Among the potential beneficiaries of this particular new limited definition of tiger corridors are Western Coalfields Limited and Lloyds Metal and Energy Limited in Maharashtra. So essentially, what are the tiger corridors? Tiger corridors are the pathways connecting the two important tiger habitats. So essentially, the movement of tigers, the wildlife becomes much more easier. So what has happened now? The NTCA has limited the number of tiger corridors to only least cost pathways. That the number currently is 32. So what is least cost pathway here? Least cost pathway identifies the routes that tigers are most likely to travel by calculating the cost or resistance of different landscapes. So tiger will assess whether this particular path they will take is cost effective or not in their head. Obviously, lower costs such as high habitat suitability, water availability and less human infrastructure density indicate more suitable and connected pathways with higher costs like roads, settlements and mines acting as a barrier. So sort of that is the calculation being done by the tiger. So essentially, least cost pathways means the tiger assesses the utility of that particular pathway through some of the benefits that the pathway will give to the tiger, such as high habitat suitability or water availability and less human, obviously less infrastructure on those particular pathways. So now the NTCA has reduced the number of tiger corridors to these particular pathways. So the least cost pathways have been further reduced and it will benefit the number of companies in this regard. So why? Because once the NTCA declares the tiger corridors or these pathways, essentially the development work in that particular area halts. So that's why whenever the number of tiger corridors are reduced, the stalled projects will further actually taken up on a war footing. So tiger corridors, these are vital wildlife pathways that connects tiger habitats, enabling animal movement, gene flow and long-term survival. So essentially the tiger corridors have its origin in the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. So Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 does not define corridors themselves. Areas linking one tiger reserve or protected area with another tiger reserve or protected area are not diverted for ecologically unsustainable uses except in public interest and with approval of the National Board for Wildlife and on advice of NTCA. So this is the major provision which is actually hindering the completion of the projects in sensitive areas. So that's why the NTCA's advisory or clarification in this regard will benefit these particular projects. So in that too in environmentally sensitive areas. The Act provides for the tiger conservation plan to ensure ecologically compatible land uses in areas linking one protected area or tiger reserves with another. So let's look at some of the tiger reserves in India. So there are total 58 tiger reserves in India. You can see the map here. This is the map which is taken from the NTCA website itself. So by the way, on the NTCA website, you will also find the interactive map as well. So that map is very interesting. You can actually click on that particular, uh, uh, arrow there on the map, and you will get all the information of that particular tiger reserve. So do visit the NTCA website to know more about the various tiger reserves. So currently, as of 2025, there are total 58 tiger reserve. So just comment in the comment section which is the latest one to get this particular designation. What is the 58th tiger reserve? That's the main question. These reserves are part of the Project Tiger initiative, which aims to protect and conserve the endangered Bengal tigers and its habitat. That is but obvious. Tiger reserves in India receive their legal backing from obviously WPA of 1972. This act provides a legal framework for the notification of core and buffer areas for tiger conservation, the management of these habitats and the regulation of activities within them, and ensuring the protection of tigers and their habitats through a statutory body and guidelines, and that statutory body is NTCA, remember that. So, protected areas in the region. So, in the current case, in that particular article, what are the protected areas mentioned? There is particularly Tadoba Andheri Tiger Reserve in Maharashtra. So remember these names. You may get important question in prelims based on these particular tiger reserves or national parks or wildlife sanctuaries. So stay tuned. Significance: it is the largest and oldest tiger reserve in Maharashtra. Remember that. Tadoba Andheri Tiger Reserve in Maharashtra is the largest and oldest tiger reserve in Maharashtra. Tadoba here means from the local deity Tadoba Taru. So the name came from the local deity. Andheri from the Andheri river flowing through the area. So this is the origin of the name Tadoba Andheri. Components include Tadoba National Park and Andheri Wildlife Sanctuary. So these are the two components included in this particular tiger reserve. Vegetation type, obviously it is southern tropical dry deciduous forest. You can see lot of the central India having the majority of these type of forests. Water bodies, Tadoba Lake, there is Kelsa Lake and Tadoba River as well. For flora, dense forest of teak, crocodile bark, salai, tendu, karaya, gum and mahua are also found. Fauna, tigers, leopards, sloth bears, wild dogs, cheetal and sambar. Generally, cheetal and sambar is the prey base for the tiger. Another name mentioned in that particular article is the name of Tipeshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, which is also in Maharashtra. It is a hilly and undulating terrain with basalt rich soil from ancient volcanic activity. Rivers Bhima, Purna, Krishna, Tapti flow through the sanctuary, earning it the nickname Green Oasis of Eastern Maharashtra. So, Green Oasis of Eastern Maharashtra, Tipeshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, remember that. Vegetation type, again southern tropical dry deciduous forest, as I earlier said. Flora, teak up to 60%, Mahua, Achar, Lindia, Bhirativas are some of the flora and forest tree types found there. Fauna, Bengal tiger, leopard, sloth bear, pangolin, four-horned antelope is also found in Tipeshwar Wildlife Sanctuary. So, by the way, no location of these particular tiger reserves as well as wildlife sanctuaries on the map. So, that is really important. Kanhargaon Wildlife Sanctuary is also mentioned. By the way, the flora and fauna here again very similar. Ecological significance: connect Tadoba Andheri Tiger Reserve to Kaval Wildlife Sanctuary, aiding tiger dispersal. So, essentially, Kanhargaon Wildlife Sanctuary is a sort of tiger corridor which connects Tadoba Andheri Tiger Reserve to Kaval Wildlife Sanctuary, which aids in tiger dispersion. So, what exactly is this National Tiger Conservation Authority? So knowing some of the basics of this particular organization is also very, very important. It is established in 2006, obviously, under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. It is a statutory body under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. What are the objectives, by the way? Give legal authority to Project Tiger for compliance enforcement, ensure center-state accountability in managing tiger reserves through MOUs, address the livelihood concerns of local communities as well. What is the composition? This is the main point here. Chairperson is obviously minister in charge of Environment, Forest and Climate Change Ministry. Vice Chairperson, Minister of State in MOEFCC. Members, 3 MPs, Secretary of MOEFCC, and other nominated members are also the members of NTCA. So, know the basics of this particular body here, important from the perspective of prelims. So, this is the practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. So, the third important article that we are going to discuss is about RBI's latest paper on monetary policy and what are the suggestions given by this particular paper now. So, the RBI recently published a discussion paper on the nation's monetary policy framework, cautioning against the potential consequences of increasing the inflation target. The RBI has invited feedback on key issues by September 18 in this regard. So, that particular is this is not that much of an important thing to know here, but the highlights of the RBI's discussion paper are important. RBI seeks feedback by September 18 before recommending the framework for 2026 to 2031. So, way back in 2016, the framework was actually implemented for the 5 years, but after that, subsequently from the 2026 to 2031, we will have new monetary policy framework, and the important suggestions are given for that particular framework in this particular paper now. So, key questions for feedback which was asked by the RBI: should monetary policy target headline or core inflation? So, in recent times we have seen even economic survey battling for change in the monetary policy framework from headline to core inflation. But should the new monetary policy framework target headline inflation as it is, or it should move from that to core inflation now? Is 4% still optimal for balancing growth and stability? That is also important question. Should the 2 to 6% tolerance band be revised or dropped? That is also very important question to be settled in the new policy monetary policy framework. Should the fixed 4% target be removed or maintain only a range in this regard? On inflation target, warned that raising the inflation target at the current juncture could be seen as a dilution of the framework and lead to the loss of policy gains made over the last decade or so. In recent times, we have seen even the Moody's, S&P changing India's rating from BBB minus to BBB. So, essentially, S&P in that regard actually lauded RBI's monetary policy framework and monetary policy overall. So, essentially, inflation control measures taken by RBI was also appreciated by S&P in that regard. So, currently RBI is very wary of changing the inflation target now. So, another important debate highlighted in that particular article, RBI's monetary policy paper, is core versus headline inflation debate. The debate on whether India's monetary policy should target headline or core inflation gained attention after the economic survey of 23-24, as I earlier said, suggested considering the core inflation. So, that economic survey of 23-24 suggested considering core inflation, which excludes volatile food and fuel prices due to high weight of food in the CPI. So, essentially, what is the logic behind switching to core inflation? Because headline inflation also includes volatile food and fuel prices, so which is prone to external fluctuations due to high weight of food in CPI. The CPI overall may also change a lot. That's the logic behind this particular recommendation by economic survey. The survey argued the food prices increases are often supply driven rather than demand induced, and the short term monetary policy tools are designed to address inflation arising from excess aggregate demand, not supply shocks. So, that is very, very right argument. This is the rightest sort of argument given by economic survey. So, essentially the food prices increases is due to the supply shock, and the RBI's monetary policy in the short term may not address the supply shock issues. So, that is the logic behind recommending that particular recommendation by the economic survey. But the RBI particularly pushed back. Headline inflation measures overall CPI including volatile items like food and fuel. Almost all inflation targeting countries use headline CPI as the target. Only Uganda targets the core inflation. So, that is the foremost argument for having the headline CPI as it is as a target for inflation control. Headline inflation has moved in a broad range of 1.5 to 8.6% since January 2014, driven by CPI food inflation, which has ranged from minus 2.7% to 14.2%. Meanwhile, the core inflation has been far more stable. So, essentially this particular point has been highlighted by the economic survey. The fluctuations in the headline CPI is due to the food prices, particularly the wild fluctuations you can see, but still majority of the countries still target headline CPI, but only the exception of Uganda is there, which targets core CPI. Core inflation excludes food and fuel to avoid volatility. Obviously, it reflects underlying inflation trends. RBI discussed whether India should focus on core inflation due to the high food weight in CPI. RBI's position in that regard, it hasn't changed much. Monetary policy cannot ignore food prices because persistent food inflation can spill over to the core inflation as well via wages, rents and markups. So, that is the logic behind RBI's own position in this regard. Empirical evidence in India, non-core prices tend to converge to core prices over time, showing interlinkages. Recent data, July CPI inflation, headline inflation of 1.55%, which is 8-year low, and CPI excluding food and fuel on the other hand showed 4.1% data. RBI warning raising inflation target or ignoring headline inflation could erode credibility, especially amidst the global uncertainty like today. Maintaining headline CPI targeting ensures policy credibility and accounts for both demand and supply side inflation pressure. So, that is the foremost position taken by RBI now. So, essentially, although the RBI's monetary policy paper now raise the same issue again, but still that particular paper also bats for the headline inflation or headline CPI targeting instead of say core inflation targeting in the new upcoming monetary policy framework. So, what is this India's targeting framework, monetary policy targeting, inflation targeting framework? RBI adopted the flexible inflation targeting FIT framework in late 2016, which targets medium-term CPI-based inflation target of 4% with a tolerance band of 2 to 6%. Validity, the target is valid for 5 years, must be reviewed after each period. Current target valid till March 2026, needs renotification for April 26, 2026 onwards. So, these are some of the basics of monetary policy committee. We have covered it so many times already in our earlier DNA episode. So, go through this particular slide here briefly as well. So, this is the practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. Very, very important. You can get a very good question on the monetary policy framework in GS3 economy mains particularly. So, note down some of the points given in the RBI's monetary policy paper in recent times. So, another important article that we are going to discuss is about India's unregulated cosmetology clinics. So, rise in the unregulated aesthetic, derma and cosmetology clinics in India is a story which we all know. In recent times, due to the explosion of the reels, the social media fad regarding cosmetology, we have seen the tremendous growth of this particular sector. Aesthetic, derma and cosmetology clinics have rapidly proliferated across India, offering a wide range of services such as hair transplants, skin lightening, chemical peels, Botox and anti-aging therapies. All these therapies are being promoted through the social media. So, oftentimes people fall prey to false advertisement as well. Driven by the booming wellness sector, the market was valued at USD $2.5 billion in 2024 and is projected to reach almost $4 billion by 2033. So, wellness sector is promoting this particular fad. Experts have highlighted the urgent need for regulation to safeguard patients from unsafe practices and unqualified practitioners. At the same time, issues in India's cosmetology industry are also important to know in this regard. Unqualified practitioners, most of the time many clinics are run by individuals without proper medical training or qualifications. Specialization in dermatology or aesthetic procedures often are lacking in this particular regard. Quackery and misrepresentation, dentists, Ayush practitioners or unrelated specialists performing complex dermatology and aesthetic procedures. Many times people have died due to this particular issue here, because if someone is not qualified to do the Botox and somebody used some some unhygienic products in that regard, the people, the person who has done those particular procedures will have the adverse reaction to those particular unhygienic products. Fake courses and certificates allow untrained people to pose as experts, and social media has exacerbated this particular trend now. As I earlier said, unlicensed or unregistered clinics, many centers operate without proper registration or government approval. Lack of medical tie-ups, clinics often have no connection with secondary or tertiary healthcare facilities for emergency referrals. Misleading marketing. So, this is the aggressive social media marketing that I am talking about. Offline advertising exaggerates results and underplay risk. So, many times you have seen these particular false advertisements. So, low patient awareness is also one of the reasons. Many clients are unaware of the qualifications of practitioners or safety of the procedures. Regulatory gap is also observed. Poor enforcement of NMC guidelines for aesthetic surgery and hair transplants. Lack of dedicated inspection bodies or regular oversight. Center and state actions, license cancellation investigations are insufficient as well. Health risk, patients face infections, chemical burns, steroid dependency, necrosis and even amputations due to the malpractices. And we have seen even people dying due to this particular cosmetology procedures in recent times. Market pressure, rapidly growing wellness and cosmetic market fuels demand, making it lucrative and for unscrupulous operators. So, in the age of social media and post-truth, the the uh, the false advertisement is harming this particular wellness of the patients themselves. Initiatives to tackle issues in the cosmetology industry is also important to know. National Medical Commission guidelines are there, though only registered medical practitioners with adequate training may perform aesthetic surgery and hair transplant procedures. Clinics are required to follow protocols on patient safety and procedural standards. State medical councils actions are in this regard important. Telangana Medical Council particularly has conducted inspections, shut down clinics in by unqualified individuals and has taken legal action under the NMC Act. Karnataka Medical Council is also proactive in this regard. It has issued public notices cautioning patients about quackery and verifying practitioners' credentials. Indian Association of Dermatologists, Venerologists and Leprologists initiatives are also there. Anti-quackery campaigns and awareness drives, platforms to verify suspicious prescriptions and procedures offered by unqualified practitioners, submissions to State Medical Council urging stricter action against unlicensed clinics. So until this point, this article is more important from the perspective of again mains GS3 particularly. Now we will discuss some of the chemicals which you may get a question on in prelims. Chemicals used in the cosmetology and aesthetic industry and their uses are also important. There is a topical steroids which is generally used or for the skin lightening, anti-inflammatory and anti-aging procedures. Botulinum toxin, that is Botox, that is generally used for wrinkle reduction, facial aesthetics. Glycolic acid, there is a TCA, salicylic acid, generally used for chemical peel, skin resurfacing and pigmentation procedures. Then there is a PPD, which is used generally in hair dye and bleaching. Then there is a PRP, which is generally used in hair growth and skin rejuvenation. Hydroquinone is there, skin whitening and pigmentation correction. Then there is mercury compound. So, mercury is also used, can you imagine, which is the part of skin lightening creams. There is hyaluronic acid, collagen, synthetic fillers, which are generally used in procedures like wrinkle reduction, lip enhancement and facial reconstruction or contouring. Photosensitizing agents for lasers are also used in laser hair removal pigmentation treatment. So, some of these chemicals are important. Remember the name of the chemicals and in which particular procedure they are used. So, this is important practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. So, in the decoded section, we are going to take a look at very interesting article in the Indian Express explain page. Particularly, the environmentalists are currently criticizing the Haryana government's definition of forest. So, the Haryana government has recently defined the forest or notified an official definition of forest, which it claims draws from the Supreme Court precedents and aligns with judicial expectations. However, the environmentalists argue that this particular definition is too narrow and risks excluding the ecologically sensitive Aravalli Ridge from protection and making it vulnerable to unchecked development, illegal mining and real estate encroachment. So, this is the primary goal here, the developments in the Aravalli range. So, most of the time, we have seen the Haryana government's efforts to actually reduce the regulation or the protection of the Aravallis. So, now the new definition is creating further concerns that it will further reduce the protection given to the Aravallis. So, what exactly is this new definition of forest currently adopted or notified by the Haryana government? A patch of land shall be deemed to be forest as per dictionary meaning if it fulfills the following conditions. So, what are those conditions? To be called a forest, it has to be a minimum area of 5 hectares if it is in isolation and a minimum area of 2 hectares if it is in contiguity with government notified forest. So, if it is in continuity with government notified forest, the minimum area should be 2 hectares. If it is in isolation, the minimum area should be 5 hectares to be called a forest, according to the dictionary meaning, by the way. And another condition is it should have the canopy density of 0.4, that is 40% or more. So, these are the two conditions which are at the root of the current debate. All linear compact agroforestry plantations and orchards situated outside the government notified forest shall not be treated as a forest under the definition. So, that is also clearly defined by the recent notification of the Haryana government. But now, what is the issue in this particular notification of Haryana government? High threshold for canopy cover. Haryana adopted 40% minimum forest canopy cover to classify the land as a forest. Aravalli's risk exclusion from the protection under the FCA. Why? Because the Aravalli hills with low rainfall and rocky terrain supports only stunted, thorny, dry deciduous species and scrub forest. With such tough ecological conditions, many areas naturally cannot reach even 40% canopy cover. So, this is the primary issue here. So, which may exclude the major area of Aravallis from the definition of forest. Minimum area requirement, like Haryana set 2 and 5 hectares as minimum area thresholds. Experts argue that this is too high for a dry state like Haryana and threshold should be 1 and 2 hectares. So, legal concerns in this regard are also raised. The definition may be prima facie a violative of the 1996 Godavarman judgment, which had given broad interpretation of the forest. So, this is the most important judgment when it comes to the definition of forest. The very transformative judgment in 1996 given by the Supreme Court, which has took the broad interpretation of forest, that is a Godavarman judgment. So, what constitutes a forest is given obviously by Supreme Court judgment in T. N. Godavarman Thirumal Pad versus Union of India in 1996, which ruled that the word forest for the FCA, that is Forest Conservation Act, must be understood according to its dictionary meaning, which covers all statutory recognized forest, whether designated as reserved, protected or otherwise. So, government must consider dictionary meaning of the forest, which is broad. Effectively, any parcel of forested land, regardless of size, official status or ownership, could be deemed as a forest according to this particular Godavarman judgment. But there are certain issues with the Godavarman judgment as well. The broad applicability of Forest Conservation Act was restricting land use changes. Even small development works like building, say, a toilet in tribal schools were being hindered due to this particular provision. So, there are there are obviously flip sides to this particular judgment. There are issues with that particular judgment. In recent times, we have Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023, which modified the 1980 FCA law. It expanded the coverage, brought more land under the Act's purview, exemptions created for national security, defense, linear projects and public utilities near border. Definition clarified. The Act clarified the definition of forest land to include only lands declared or notified as forest under Indian Forest Act of 1927 or recorded as a forest by October 25, 1980, which excluded certain plantations and lands alongside roads as well and from this particular definition. So, the Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023 changed the definition of the forest. Concerns raised by environmentalists and former civil servants led to a legal challenge, with the Supreme Court issuing an interim order in February 2024 emphasizing the adherence to its 1996 Godavarman case definition of the forest. So, after the challenge to the recent act of 2023, Supreme Court reaffirmed its Godavarman judgment to use the broader use of forests. So, there is also Supreme Court's March 2025 directive in this regard as well. The bench reiterated that the expression forest would be understood according to the broad and all-encompassing dictionary meaning as held in its T.N. Godavarman judgment of December 1996 until further orders. Definition of forest under this particular act, or rather this particular judgment, all states and union territories must clearly define what constitutes a forest. So, Supreme Court gave these particular directives. States and UTs must initiate surveys to identify forest areas within their respective jurisdictions. Expert committees need to be formed. Each state and UT must set up expert committees within 1 month. The committee must identify and map forest-like areas, unclassified forest lands and community forest lands. Reports of the mapping must be submitted to the center within 6 months. So, that is the directive given by Supreme Court in its latest order in March 2025. So, let us see what comes up in this regard in the upcoming times. So, what about guideline compliance? Process must strictly follow the 2011 Lafarge Umium mining guidelines, mandating GIS-based decision support database that includes district-wise plots that may qualify as forest under the Forest Conservation Act, core buffer and ecologically sensitive areas of protected areas, important wildlife migratory corridors, records of land diverted from forest use in the past, supporting maps such as topo sheets and Forest Survey of India map, chief secretaries of states and administrators of UTs who fail to comply will be held personally accountable for any non-compliance. So, these are some of the directives issued by the Supreme Court in its latest 2025 guidelines. Significance of the definition of forest. It gives obviously the legal protection, determines which lands fall under the FCA and other environment laws, include ensuring they receive statutory protection. Conservation of biodiversity is also important. Goal of defining the forest. Land use regulation influences which areas are subject to restrictions on deforestation, mining or infrastructure development. Balancing development with sustainability. Judicial oversight aligns state and central policies with Supreme Court rulings. For example, in this case, a Godavarman case, preventing arbitrary exclusions of forest land. Environmental planning, socio-economic impact affects local communities and tribal rights. Land use for schools, utilities and development projects. So, preventing encroachment, accurate definitions reduce the risk of illegal and diversion of or real estate development in ecologically sensitive areas. So, definition of forest, it has its own benefits as well as drawbacks to certain extent particularly, but it will lead to the the protection of our valuable forest. So, this is the practice question for you. Important analysis again from the perspective of GS3 environment. That's it from my side, and stay tuned for daily news analysis for another edition. Thank you.